Well, it has been almost 4 years since I rocked the world with my public comment that allowing children to transition their sex amounted to child abuse. Many well-meaning persons thought that they had discovered a new way to prevent mysterious teenage suicides. They were aghast that Barry Neufeld had the nerve to question this new wisdom. I need to emphasize that my greatest motivation in taking my controversial stand is because of my compassion and concern for hurting and at-risk young people. I fear they will be misled by this ideology. They may be tempted to think they were born in the wrong body when that's not their real problem. According to the School Act of BC, it is one of my duties to approve of learning resources. I believe that public education should be secular, and it has very little to do with my religion. I'm opposed to SOGI 123 mainly because of the gender ideology, which I believe has the characteristics of a sectarian cult. It is a primitive anthropology, the ancient Gnostic conception of the ghost in the machine. The Bible has nothing to say about this new idea, so Christians are divided in how to lovingly assist a gender dysphoric person who is suffering. There's even a bishop I know who accuses persons like myself of murdering gender dysphoric children when we discourage their transition to the opposite sex with drugs and plastic surgery. I attended Megan Murphy's information session with Dr. Kenneth Zucker on gender ideology a couple of years ago. I was greeted by hysterical protesters who were screaming, "The blood of transgender children is on your hands." Well, this bothered me because I do not want to cause any more suffering for transgender people. I don't hate them. Was I really contributing to their pain? Dr. Zucker was speaking, and he was one of the world authorities on treating gender dysphoric children. He says this idea of suicide is a trope. It's merely a figure of speech to scare parents because it conflates suicidal ideation with completed suicide. Dr. Wallace Wong is the psychologist who refers children to the BC Children's Hospital for gender transition therapy. He admitted that he tells his patients to manipulate their parents and therapists by threatening suicide if they don't get their own way. How unethical. However, last December, the British High Court could not find any evidence that gender dysphoric children are likely to commit suicide if they are not allowed to transition. It was only propaganda spread by transgender activists. I think that misguided bishop owes me an apology, and he owes an apology to worried parents of gender-confused youngsters who are wrestling with the question, would you rather have a dead daughter or a living son, or vice versa? At first, I was accused of basing my outdated opinions on junk science, so at my own expense, I attended an international conference of child psychiatry in Europe to learn the very latest in the field. There was a lot of enthusiasm for the policy of affirming gender identity, but there was also a lot of skepticism. Successful gender transition therapists were suspected of making rushed and incomplete psychiatric assessments. Affirmative therapy was recommended far too often while overlooking underlying issues. While I firmly believe in protecting human rights of all minorities, including those with varying sexual orientations and gender identities, I do not believe that encouraging and celebrating children's transition is in their best interest. Encouraging the false idea that they can change sex is unethical. And it's well known that if children are not allowed to socially transition, 80 to 90% of them will grow out of it and become content with the bodies they have. A lot has happened in the past 3 years since I first spoke out. More and more detransitioners are going public. This was featured on the recent CBS TV show 60 Minutes. Walt Heyer, Kiera Bell, and Jamie Shoup are now telling heartrending stories of how they regretted damaging their bodies with chemicals, hormones, and surgery. Finland was the first country to stop the transition of children in 2020. A year later, the British High Court also began to restrict transition of children in late 2021, in the case of Kiera Bell. And now in Sweden, one of the countries who pioneered gender transition, has made it illegal for any child under the age of 16 to medically transition. Several American states have also begun to write similar laws. Here in Canada, and especially British Columbia, our public education and medical bureaucrats still cling to the transgender narrative. As Gavin Ashenden, former chaplain to the Queen, said,
"But to take a tiny, the mental discomfort of a tiny community, where you're in one body and you believe you ought to be in another, of a tiny, tiny part of the community, and begin to turn that into a kind of strategy of dealing with the world is a very odd thing to do. Frankly, it's a bit crazy. Behind the whole trans thing is this principle of getting rid of objective reality, objective standards, objective morality. The real truth about the world is whatever you think it is in your head. Because freedom of speech and freedom of thought and objective reality and finding out what's real in the world is under threat. And it's crazy that the Western world, with its gift of freedom, is just walking blindly into it because they want to be nice to groups who appear to have been disadvantaged. Sometimes they have, sometimes they haven't. Evil flourishes when good people do nothing. We've done nothing too long. So can we slow it down? We can, by speaking out against it, by protesting against it, by refusing to accept the narrative that's imposed upon us.
Recent graduates from our universities have entered the real world with a new desire to create utopia. Critical theories on gender, race, colonialism, and even obesity are determined to tear down what we used to consider as normative, true, and wise. They will be replaced with a novel, untried ideology. History is full of examples of movements and cults that sincerely tried to create a utopia, but it turned out to be a disaster in the end. I recently spoke at a public rally opposing child transition in front of the Vancouver Art Gallery. There were a lot of hecklers, but for once, most of the public seemed in favor of people with opinions like myself. Feminists like Germaine Greer, J.K. Rowling, Megan Murphy, and Amy Hamm are bravely speaking out despite being hammered by the radical activists. It has been some time since I sent out a newsletter. Some have asked me what's happening with my court cases. I have to admit, sometimes I also wonder. My current situation is that I am now embroiled in no less than 6 court cases. The first challenge was the complaint to the Canadian Union of Public Employees to the BC Human Rights Tribunal that I and the Board of Education posed a danger to their workers. This union represents secretaries, janitors, bus drivers, and educational assistants. But this complaint has been stalled for 3 years because they can't come up with the names of anyone who feels threatened. Secondly, there was the complaint of the BC Teachers Federation to the BC Human Rights Tribunal that I pose a danger to their workers. It is stalled for almost 3 years for the same reason. Thirdly, my defamation suit against Glenn Hansman, president of the BCTF. Hansman countered with an anti-SLAPP application, which is a brand new law to prevent vexatious lawsuits. He argued that he had the right to insult me in the public interest. His legal team backed this up with a 600-page affidavit. A new judge, recently appointed by Justin Trudeau, was assigned to hear the application. He had never heard a defamation suit before, and this was the first time an anti-SLAPP suit had been heard in British Columbia. After a few months' deliberation, Judge Ross granted Hansman's application with 50 pages of reasons. We were disappointed, but we appealed his decision. It was heard by the Court of Appeal in November last year, but 6 months later, the 3 judges still have not released their decision. It is important that we win this case to prevent the appalling intimidation and bullying by radical social justice advocates. They are making it impossible for people with conservative family values and morals to run for public office in Canada. I have applied to the Supreme Court to force the Human Rights Tribunal to drop the silly complaints that have dragged on for 3 years and still can't be settled. The Human Rights Tribunal is only a quasi-court. The people appointed to hear complaints are not judges or even trained lawyers. They're mostly social justice activists. But if I had been charged with a serious crime like murder, my accusers would have only 18 months to prove their case against me. After that, the charges would be thrown out of court because unreasonable delay is considered an abusive process. No such safeguard is available to citizens accused in a human rights tribunal. However, CUPE fired their activist pro bono lawyer last summer, and their staff lawyer made an offer to me and the Board of Education to settle their complaint. Although my government-appointed lawyers encouraged me to accept a settlement, I could not in good conscience do it. I am critical of an educational learning resource, and I am not a threat to any person. Neither is the school board, for that matter. So I refuse to agree to an out-of-court settlement. Even though there was no proof of any wrongdoing, 4 trustees on the Chilliwack Board of Education tried to hold a secret meeting without notifying me. They were planning to make a backroom deal with CUPE by approving the donation of several $1,000s to an agency not associated with public education. I managed to get into that secret meeting because I had applied to dismiss the complaints, and I accused my colleagues of throwing me under the bus. They threatened me, so I blew the whistle on them for convening an illegal meeting. The meeting took place October 5th, and Dan Coulter, a very active member of CUPE, voted to award his fellow union brothers with a settlement. If that is not a conflict of interest, I don't know what is. At the time, he was running as a candidate for the BC NDP, and he received generous financial donations from CUPE through the Fraser Valley Labour Council. Of course he wanted to grease their palms. And as soon as he was elected, less than 3 weeks later, he hired Miss Willow Richelt as his constituency assistant. Now, Miss Willow Richelt, the chair of the Chilliwack School Board, has collaborated with Peter Lang, a failed candidate for the school board, to launch a new lawsuit against me. They're asking the court to disqualify me or anyone who thinks like me from running for public office in British Columbia. Their goal is that only left-wing extremists will be allowed to participate in the democratic process. So I took a page from Glenn Hansman's playbook, and I stopped her lawsuit with an anti-SLAPP suit of my own. It is scheduled to be heard in New Westminster on June the 25th, and you're welcome to join me there if you can, please. What's tragic about all this controversy is that the school board has been so totally focused on placating the small percentage of LGBTQ students in our district that they have ignored the real purpose of public education. The 4 radical trustees have focused all their energy for the past 3 years on turning the school district and the whole community into a woke culture that celebrates non-heterosexual lifestyles. I understand that they believe that if LGBT students feel accepted, that they will do better in school, and perhaps they will. But the exact opposite has happened. The Minister of Education is not pleased that for the last 5 years, the academic achievement and the average of all students in Chilliwack has been steadily declining. They have given us 6 months to turn that around. This was based on the results of the Foundation Skills Assessment, the FSA scores, and the graduation rates. And the boys' rates are deteriorating even further. For the past 10 years, I've noticed that the girls are walking away with all the scholarships at the commencement ceremonies and very few of the boys. Why is this? Well, I believe there are 3 reasons. The first reason is this philosophy that there's no clear difference between the genders is preventing teachers from realizing that boys learn differently than girls, and teachers must adjust their teaching methods accordingly. 43% of all boys live at home with single-parent mothers, and 78% of the teachers in our public school system are females. I'm not saying that feminine influence is bad, but without the balance of positive male role models, most of our boys are suffering. Furthermore, there is plenty of new research quoted by author Leonard Sachs in his book, Why Gender Matters, What Parents and Teachers Need to Know About the Emerging Science of Sex Differences. It's true that boys as a group have different learning styles and different educational needs. The gender fluid ideology refuses to even look at or consider this important fact. Secondly, before I stirred up the controversy over unscientific gender theories in SOGI 123, a scandal was beginning to unfold in the Chilliwack School District. 5 years ago, the administration had implemented a new reading and math programs based on ideology, not best practices. They used erroneous FSA scores to persuade the board that this was very effective, and so the board allocated an extra $1.5 million to support this program with professional development and other supports. The board a year later found out that the FSA scores were all wrong. The results were getting worse, not better. It's not clear if this was a deliberate fraud or simply incompetence. So, I was a convenient distraction. The investigation was stalled for a year by all the drama that ensued over my legitimate objections to SOGI 123. However, after the election on October 20th, but before the new board was sworn in, the superintendent went on extended sick leave. Therefore, she was not available to answer questions. Furthermore, 3 trustees who had enthusiastically supported these new programs and were aware of the mistake decided not to run for election again. The new board was not interested in investigating this scandal. To right this wrong, the board will have to retrain the teachers, giving them the proper methods to teach the 3 R's. Unfortunately, I doubt if this current board has the will or courage to do this for our students. The board is currently working on a new strategic plan. It is full of woke ideology, banal platitudes, and trendy catchwords like scaffolding, equity, affirmation, and inclusive. Whenever I hear that overused word inclusive, it reminds me of Cole Porter's song, Anything Goes. But the strategic plan has no definite plans on how to improve student achievement. Although I was elected with more votes than any other trustee, I've been barred from so many committees that I have had absolutely no participation in the formulation of this new strategic plan, and I have absolutely no ownership of it. Those of my critics who think that I am making too much of a big issue out of the SOGI 123 gender theories, I have this to say. I counter the argument this is far more involved than being inclusive of 0.5% of students who may be suffering from gender dysphoria. It strikes at the very heart of what public education should be achieving. It's negatively impacting the majority of our students. When I spoke at the Stand Up Speak Up rally in Vancouver, I said that if the ministry would not allow some amendments and changes to SOGI 123, I would advise parents to take their children out of public school. They have 3 options: private, independent schools, homeschooling, or online learning. I was interested to hear that in Calgary they have another option, a charter school without union influence. Since this lawsuit against me involves a dispute over the CUPE complaints, I had hoped my trustee indemnity would cover my legal expenses. But so far, the school's protection plan has not made a decision on this. I am so thankful to my lawyer, Paul Jaffe, who has believed in me and done a lot of work on my behalf. But I need to raise more money for my defense in this new lawsuit. Some of you supported me in the past, and I thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. But I need to ask you again. You can send money by an e-transfer to trusteeneufeld@gmail.com, or you can mail a check to Post Office Box 3002, Cultus Lake, British Columbia, V2R 5H6, or donate online to the Barry Neufeld GoFundMe page. Thank you very much.